to.
Sure, no problem.
YouTube.
Yes, Vedant, start.
Yes. So a very good evening, everyone. My name is Vedant Tukreja, and I welcome you all in today's session, which is on intersectional relation between gender studies and criminal laws. So before starting, let me introduce Just Corpus and our eminent guest speaker of the day. So talking about Just Corpus is a double-blind, peer-reviewed, interdisciplinary e-journal that provides a platform to students, academicians, scholars, professors, professionals in the field of law to publish their article, blogs, case comments, or research papers. And talking about the guest speaker of our day, Madam Sanchita. So she is an advocate on record in Supreme Court of India and partner at ASV Legal LLP. She was awarded as Top 100 Lex Falcon Awardee. With an experience of almost a decade in the field of law, she has handled complex matters before the Supreme Court, High Court, and other forums of the country. These include the landmark constitutional cases like linking of PAN with Aadhaar card, triple talaq, 2G spectrum, affirmative action, right of minority institutions, and many more. And also she holds a degree, LLM degree in International Human Rights Law with distinction from University of Essex. She has also advised various startups, early stages company, and clients from entertainment industry. And she is frequently invited by renowned universities to deliver lectures and judge competitions. She is also an Icon Lead Fellow, and she is India's first leadership program and for the women with disabilities. So very good evening, ma'am. I welcome you in today's session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vedant.
Over to you, ma'am.
Great. I think it's a very, very interesting topic chosen by the organization. I really would like to first, thank you for choosing this topic, because the aspect of intersectionality, while it's discussed in other disciplines, in legal studies, in the study of law, where we all are looking at the practical aspects, wanting to be, successful lawyers, we sometimes miss it out unless we are into research, and it's only then that we focus on these aspects. Whereas these are very, very important aspects to consider to understand how and why laws are being framed in a certain manner. Should there be an amendment? Like we had Justice Verma committee. I mean, who must Justice Verma and all the committee members would have been? What would they have studied? What would they have done to be able to come up with such a comprehensive report, to be able to understand the nitty-gritties of the aspect? The Justice Verma, why was he chosen in the first place? He was chosen because of his understanding of the subject, right? Vishaka judgment, when you read it, you understand that the person who wrote it, the judge who wrote the judgment, he had a kind of understanding that was missing earlier, right? And therefore, it's important to understand intersectionality. And I would try to also include the aspect of gender neutral laws, whether or not it should be gender neutral as well in this discussion, because they are very, very intricately connected. So first, let's understand why they are in place, and then let's look at this aspect as well. So since the topic is gender studies and crime, criminal law, therefore, let's understand why gender studies are called gender studies. Earlier, we use the term women's studies, okay? But now we prefer the term gender studies. And why? Because ultimately, even when we had gender studies department, and I also hold a PG diploma in women's studies from the same university where I was doing law. I was doing both simultaneously. When I was in fourth year, I did a part-time course, and that really opened my mind to a great, great extent. And I was also involved in certain kind of, in trying to ensure equality in the campus. I did a lot of stuff in the campus to create liberal spaces in the campus. And therefore, I could see where my understanding of the subject of gender studies, though it was called women's studies at that time, was having an impact in what I was trying to achieve in the campus. So we were told right at the beginning that the focus is of the discipline is to achieve equality. It's not to say that women have to be given more preference, etc. It's only aimed at achieving equality, and it's because there is a certain kind of inequality, and that inequality is affecting both men and women, what we call patriarchy, that's affecting men and women both, and therefore we need to address that issue. Now, the problem always has been that the LGBTQIA community has not been considered to that extent. And I feel it's also because we don't have safe spaces for people belonging to the community to come out and talk about what their issues are, right? And therefore, it's going to take a very, very long time to even make those changes in the law, and whether or not we need any changes. For all that, it's going to take a longer time because really we don't have safe spaces for such people to open up and talk about, to even say that we are so and so, even to that. We don't have those kind of safe spaces. We haven't been yet, as a society, been able to provide them those safe spaces, right? Even after the homosexuality provision and all of that, 377, section 377 IPC being struck down, still there is such a long gap between acceptability and decriminalization per se, right? So that's the purpose why we call it gender studies. It's not to give preference to women. It's not to say that women need to be treated differently. It's just to bring equality, because patriarchy hits both men and women and people of all genders equally, right? And it also gives us a space to talk about non-binary genders as well, right? And the equality we are trying to achieve here is substantive equality. This is a very, very important aspect to understand whenever we talk about equality, discrimination among different classes of society. Many of you would be students, you will be arguing for people belonging to marginalized communities. Whenever you do that, do remember that the objective of the principle of equality, what Article 14 stands for, is substantive equality. And therefore, whatever provisions are being provided, whether or not you think reservation is justified, etc., but these provisions are based on the lines that there should be substantive equality. So you need to be able to argue on those grounds whether you are in favor or against those provisions, right? Okay, so the thing is, of course, there's a certain kind of, we'll come to the power dynamics, power relations aspect when we start discussing the gender neutrality aspect of it. Right now, first begin with understanding. I would like to begin with gender-based violence, because all the provisions that IPC deal with ultimately has got something to do with gender-based violence, right? Of course, when you look at all the provisions from the intersectionality point of view, you need to see women and non-binary peoples belonging to non-binary genders as both offenders and victims. They can be both offenders and victims. And how power relations can affect them, if they're victims, if they're offenders, has to be seen and needs to be balanced even while framing the law and while implementation of the law, or when you are arguing a case, you need to be able to point out what's actually happening and what happens, how the stereotypical notions affect the way, for example, a woman accused may be looked at in a certain kind of society. We don't have those kind of discussions, right? Do we actually see it that way? We don't know. Maybe when men are accused, then we have a bias against them. If women are accused, we may not have. But if a woman belongs to a lower caste, we have seen then the bias hits in. If a woman is a victim of a lower caste, then again we have seen a bias hits in, right? We remember the Mathura case. We remember the kind of judgment that was written in it. Right? So these things do happen. So whenever you're talking about intersectionality, don't just stop at gender and law. No, there are other aspects also. So when you have to deal with not just gender, for example, if you deal with caste, or you have to also deal with disability, then the things get different. It's way more adverse than just looking at one dimension. Right, so let's talk about gender-based violence, GBV. This is something that's recognized even by the UN, by the international bodies. So what is it? So I would like to give you a definition uh, to set the context of our discussion today, right? So uh, it's a kind of violence. It's a very, very comprehensive. I'm not saying that this is hardcore definition. It can be defined very rigidly. It can be defined very, but this is just to set the context. It's a behavior intended to exert control and power. So that's why you have the aspects of emotional abuse, you have the aspect of financial abuse, etc. also in it. Earlier, we would understand it only in terms of physical violence, and therefore the definition would be restricted. But now you need to understand, even when a physical violence is being exerted, the reason behind it is actually this. It's a behavior intended to exert control and power. Even when a child is being hit, I think this is something we all can relate to, right? When parents hit a child, it can be for their betterment, it can be for any reason, but what is the basis? When you look at the core, what is it? It's to exert control and power. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing, but that's what it is. It's to exert control and power over someone who can be a family member, household member, intimate partners, colleagues, or any other person in private or in public, right? And I have given you that disclaimer. I didn't say it's a good thing or a bad thing, but just imagine it on yourself, somebody trying to exert power on you, controlling you in a certain manner by certain behavior. Right? What does it do to you? Just imagine your colleague doing it. Imagine a teacher doing it, right? And you know the difference. You know the difference when a teacher is just scolding you because he wants you to do well in class, or when it's done with an intention to exert power or control, right? So what does it do? It makes you feel violated, right? Now people can see it, people sometimes cannot feel it, what you're going through, but it makes you feel violated. I'm sure all of you would have undergone some sort of violence at some point in your life. Therefore, just go back to that time and try to imagine. It also helps when you're arguing in court to be able to relate to what the person you're representing would have gone through, right? And then to make the judge able to relate to that, right? And sometimes your own personal accounts can also help you do that. It can be once, it can be a few times, it can be several times, it's still violence, right? It can be in a subtle form, in a structural form, right? It can be in a way that nobody can see, but it's a structural way. What is structural way? It's there in the structure itself, the way it operates, right? Can be subtle. So that's what we call a glass ceiling, right? The kind of stereotypical notions that people have about what women can do, cannot do, for example, right? How bad drivers they are, for example. So suppose there's a woman of an accused in an accident case, road accident case. What do you think? Wouldn't there be a bias? Would there be a bias? Wouldn't there be a bias? So all that's there in which the law, even if it wants to, may not be able to take care of, right? It's something that solely depends on the judge and how he exercises his own discretion, stays away from the biases and just looks at the evidence. And trust me, it's a very difficult thing to do because they're part of society, right? Okay. Then the language that's used is violence against women. So I also want you to understand how language is used and how language also reflects something that's so inherent that you need to be able to identify and pick it. And sometimes, so I have started practicing this, that I don't tell it all the time to everyone, right? There's a certain way you can talk about it. So, for example, violence against women, and I'll give you examples when I have done it in court, okay, and how I have addressed those issues with languages and arguments that are very, very problematic, and you really want to tell the other side, hey, you can't be saying this. This is very derogatory, but still those arguments are made, and still sometimes those arguments can be entertained as well. It's very difficult to, point out the stigma, to point out how all of these stereotypical notions may be affecting the judgment. Right. So now we were talking about I forgot what was violence against women. So violence against women, can you see there's no actor in it? We are not saying who is committing violence against this woman. That's very tricky way the language is used, and I want to point this out because this is how subtle, in subtle manner, things happen, and we don't notice, and therefore our even both men and women think in a certain manner, and language has a very important role to assert these kind of stereotypes, right? Gender-based violence. Now, what can be the different types of GBVs? Let's look at it from different angles. Now, the GBV that we recognize, that even UN recognizes, based on data. Again, it's very important for you to know what is the basis for saying that there's violence against women happening. Not because you can only see maybe one or two incidents, and based on that you'll say that, okay, this is the percentage, and you'll also see the amount of abuse that's happening, and it may be so massive, and it may be so, it may have such an impact on you that abuse may seem to be way more problematic for you. But these people have looked at data worldwide, right? Have looked at data in the whole of India and come to this conclusion that this is happening against women a lot more, and therefore it's been called gender-based violence, right? And there is something happening in the power structure which is still not rectified, because of which this is still happening and very much rampant in the society, right? And this is a fact, right? So you have you also have violence against LGBTQIA community, right? So you'll find whoever are in the fringes, whoever is a minority. For me, the reason why it happens is because the other community, the community which is in control, you may say, which is in majority, you may say, sometimes even minority may be under control. But generally, the majority community, since the narrative of the minority community is so fewer, right? You do not come across so many. And when I say minority here, I mean the marginalized, the people who are in the fringes, who are maybe lesser in number, or who are not as visible. So, for example, the disability community, we don't see them as much. Why? Because many are restricted in their homes. So we don't know the problems they're facing. We're not able to relate to them in any manner because their experiences are very, very different from ours. Therefore, there's always a gap that remains in our understanding of those experiences, and therefore a lot of violence is committed by us without knowing that we are doing it. That also happens, and that comes within the definition of violence. Trust me, we do that all the time. I have a disability, but I may be inflicting violence against people of other disabilities because I do not know exactly what they would need and what would constitute violence against them. And therefore, there is always a gap in the understanding of violence. And there's also a gap, and therefore a lot of violence is committed against them because of that gap, because majority community fails to understand what these marginalized communities are going through, what their actual stories are, right? You have domestic violence, you have intimate partner violence, right? You also have indirect or structural violence, physical, psychological, sexual, economic. All of these are types of gender-based violence, right? Now, what do these gender-based violence law aim at doing? They are not just aiming at penalizing, they're not just aiming at punishing, they're also aimed at preventing, protecting, supporting. So that's why you'll find Domestic Violence Act, right? Prohibiting and redressing. Why is it necessary to do all this? These are also, so ultimate aim is to ensure non-discrimination, right? Is to ensure equality, because violence is the worst form of discrimination. It's of course cruelty, it's of course a lot of other things, but even if it's very subtle, even if it's very minor, it's the worst form of non-discrimination, right? It makes you feel violated, and therefore it affects you in more ways than you can perhaps imagine. Um, Again, this is based on CDOS. There is a convention in place which talks about discrimination of a woman and discrimination against women, and is intended to eliminate it, right? So therefore, based on that, there's legislation in force. There are legislations in force right now, right? We also have WASH in place, right? So these are some of the examples, which is again not criminal in nature per se. Even DV is quasi criminal. The proceedings are quasi criminal, but it's definitely there to take care of gender-based violence, right? So you'll find there are different kinds of laws in place. It's not just always criminal. Different kinds of laws to address the issues in different manner, to eliminate discrimination, to stop violence, right? The other aspect, when I was talking about how I was giving example of Mathura's case, how custodial rape was seen differently, how it was then interpreted as something to do with caste. How we have seen in recent times that there has been a lot of reporting. These incidents were happening earlier as well, the little women and girls being raped, but these events are being reported way more these days. So we understand that a lot of these things are happening in the society, more so because women's bodies are seen as sites of social control. This is important for your understanding, that if you can, that's the reason why whenever there's war or there's any sort of disruption in the society between two communities or two nations, then women are targeted, women are raped, because it seems as if you are winning the war against the other person by controlling the woman of their woman against ours. Okay, so that's how it's seen, and it's important to understand that aspect as well. Then you have, I used to call women, people see women as markers of their culture as well. So you will find there are more, I'm sorry, it's going a little off, but in order to understand intersectionality, perhaps this is important to understand that there will be a more number of cultural, these kind of traditional, whatever you call it, kind of aspects imposed on women than on men, right? So all those aspects are there. That's how society tends to see it, and therefore it's important to understand, when you're understanding what's the basis of these laws, it's important to understand why why these laws are in place, what's the basis, how the society sees women, etc., or people of LGBTQIA. I mean, that's completely different. It's still there's so much left to be explored in that aspect, as to why they go through violence, why they need to be controlled. There's something that's not right about them. Perhaps that's how society perceives it, and therefore thinks it important to control them in different ways, right? Many of it is not visible, but then when you give them safe spaces, you get to know more. Right. So now let's talk about, maybe we'll switch to the argument of abuse, and then we can take a few questions, and then we can proceed further. Um, Argument of abuse. So first, let me begin with what Justice Geeta Mittal had said as when she was Chief Justice of Jammu and Kashmir High Court. I found her to be a very, very sensitive judge. Even with disability issues, she took so much cognizance when a blind student was not allowed to board a train, right? He couldn't write his exams, and the way she was handling that case, the way guidelines were framed, I was very impressed. So she writes this, and I find it very, 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 if I have to explain why these laws are in place and how they should be implemented, I think this is one of the paragraphs I would always want to go back to. She was taking so much cognizance of the violence cases being committed against women during COVID times, and this is a paragraph where she explains why and how these violence, what are the barriers per se that we almost ignore many times. We don't know about them, how severe they can be for women. And when we are saying woman, we are talking about different classes, we're talking about different kinds of societies, we're talking about all, rural, urban, everything together. We're not just talking about our homes or their homes or all the people in our circle. It goes way beyond that, and she's talking about those women and girls. Even at the best of the time, women and girls face tremendous barriers in accessing means to meet for help and securing justice. Illiteracy, financial incapacity, ignorance of available assistance, family and societal barrier, fear of formal institutions like police, insufficient legal aid, lack of information, etc., impede women from accessing resources against domestic violence being faced by them. The biggest obstacle to a woman seeking assistance against abuse and domestic violence is the fact she has to go against intimate domestic partners or her own family members, right? The lack of enforcement as well as alternative source of residence also impedes women from filing complaints with police, right? There is also a huge trust deficit. This is something you'll find in all people who find themselves in powerless situations, right? I'm not talking just about women. There can be men from a certain caste who can find themselves in such powerless situations that they think nothing can be done about it. Even if they go to the police, nothing will happen. But here you have an issue where women think, where would they go if they file a complaint against their husbands or her in-laws? And therefore, all the more reason why those incidents happen against them, because people know they have nowhere to go. So that's one of the reasons why when these laws are in place or these laws need to be implemented properly, right? And there were also, of course, when we come to 498A, let me read out its statement of objects and reasons. So I don't know how many of you remember recently there was a controversy with Justice UU Lalit had passed an order, and then it was questioned, and then even there were lawyers who didn't like it, and then it was reconsidered by a 3-judge bench headed by Justice Deepak Mishra, right? So I'll go to that judgment as well in a while. But first, let's look at 498A statements of objects and reasons. The increasing number of dowry deaths is a matter of serious concern. Now, this is 1983. We need to reassess if it's the same, and therefore we'll look at the Mishra's judgment. The extent of evil has been commented upon by the Joint Committee, etc., etc. Cases of cruelty by the husband and the relatives of husband, which culminate in suicide by or murder of the hapless woman concerned, constitute only a small fraction of the cases involving such cruelty. Now, this is important. There are only very few women. You come across only those cases where you have heard that she's committed suicide or she's been murdered. There's so many, they constitute only a fraction of cases. There's so many other cases. Even I was giving example that you know only women around you, but you don't even know if there are women in your neighborhood who are dealing with all this, right? This happens within 4 walls, so it's very difficult to know. It is therefore proposed to amend. This is the reason why it was amended in 1983, right? Now the problem that had emerged is the misuse, right? And therefore, courts thought, Supreme Court kind of made that observation, and people got very concerned that this observation may be used against women, and there is an inherent I would call it a kind of. I'll read out another judgment for you. I'll read out a judgment where I was telling you where it was very difficult to kind of explain that this is not an advantage. So this was with regard to reasonable accommodation for someone with disability. Reasonable accommodation is the kind of modifications that's made in the system to accommodate someone with disability. So a certain a doctor was sitting for a UPSC examination, and he needed a scribe to write his exam because he couldn't write by himself, right? He had something called writer's cramp. Now I have a dystonia and it affects my hands also. If it's only in hands, then it's also called right to scribe. So I used to, I had a scribe for writing exams. So I had volunteered and assisted the court in this matter. It was a virtual hearing, and Justice Chandrachuru, Justice Indira Banerjee, and Justice Khanna were hearing the matter. So I volunteered, and they allowed me to appear. And I will just read out the judgment or the paragraph that deals with the aspect of abuse. So this was the main point, and even Justice Chandrachud initially thought that this will be abuse. When I was explaining him what happens in the UK, how we were told that these are the kinds of arrangements that can be made for you, and it was on us to pick and choose which ones do we want. If you have this, then you have this design. Like you could also avail of exemption from attendance. You could get note takers. Now I didn't avail of all this because I wanted to attend classes, right? But these, if they are seen as advantages, then the attitude becomes different, right? So I was trying to explain it's not to be seen as an advantage. It's just like Maternity Benefit Act, for example. Maybe when it was enacted, it was seen as an advantage where women would get leave. Oh no, why should all the pregnant women get leave? Only those who are facing some issues should get leave. Something of that sort. Now that seems absurd now, right? Because we've got used to that kind of an arrangement where you automatically know someone's on leave for 6 months. So, okay, this is the arrangement we need to make. Right, but with other sorts of with other laws in place now, it gets very difficult. I mean, why does Sanchita need a recliner? Why is there a recliner for not even the question why she needs a recliner? Why is there who gave her a recliner? How did? Why? Right? These are the questions that emerge. So there was a time when I couldn't sit on a chair. I used to fall down. And trust me, there were no questions asked by any of my. I worked with two people, amazing people who, Mr. Shadana Farasat, he's an EOR, and Mr. Salman Khurshid. They didn't ask me any questions. They said, you need it, you tell me what you need, and I'll provide it to you because it's my responsibility, it's my duty to do it. This is the kind of attitude that's required. Otherwise, it becomes very, very difficult if the attitude is focused on preventing misuse, right? Because it just beats the purpose of law. Then I'll just read out the paragraph from this judgment, Vikash Kumar versus UPSC. This is Justice Chandrachud's judgment. Right, such a view presumes, now this is on the aspect of misuse. Such a view presumes persons with disabilities as a class incompetent and incapable of success, absent access to untoward assistance. The disabled confront stereotypes in several aspects of their day-to-day lives. One of them is that they do not perform as well as others. Right? So this is a stereotype. They cannot perform as well as other people, and it becomes a very, very big problem if you start performing as well. Then people start seeing why is she being able to, or she's being given this, and therefore, she's getting some sort of favor. That's why she's performing well. Now these kind of issues become a problem. Like you have to deal with it within yourself as to why you're feeling that she must be getting some sort of favor and therefore she's performing well, better than us. So she deals with so much and still she's doing so well. These are your issues, your insecurities, deal with it. Right? Like other stereotypes, this one is also totally flawed and contrary to reality, such an ableist premise. And therefore, I would like to say, this is a term I always use, this ableist approach. Once I did that, even I do it everywhere. If it's ableist, I call it ableist because we are used to using sexist term. We know what is deemed to be sexist and what is not. But ableism is something which is so new that we end up being ableist and we do not know, right? So that's what it says. It says in as many words that this is an ableist approach. So maybe when we focus on misuse of gender laws, it may be, I'm just giving you a proposition to consider, it may be a sexist approach, and perhaps it's possible to look at the law differently and to see if any of our own stereotypical notions is coming in way of its implementation. Because as the judge as Justice Deepak Mishra, and I'm not saying it myself, that there are already sufficient safeguards in place for these kind of, for preventing any kind of abuse. Right, so already we have those safeguards which are general in nature, like if there's a false case being filed, if somebody perjury, all of those provisions are there. They are common for all, right? So if there's a false case of theft being registered, you know what to do. Nobody is saying, hey, remove that from the law book, because you know what, there are false cases being registered. If somebody has to settle a score with me, they'll come and tell me, oh, they'll go to the police and tell them that, oh, she has done this to me and she's done that to me. This is how you put it. Same can happen with any of the provisions, right? Same can happen with any provision. And it happens. There are false cases being registered by both sides, and we have seen those kind of cases in court. The other day, somebody committed suicide because he was not able to handle. There were false cases being filed by both sides. We have those examples as well. Perhaps the answer to that is if we can dispose of those cases in a fast manner, the investigation can be expedited so that the person against whom those false cases are being registered, do not face hardship for such a long time, so that justice can be done, as soon as possible, etc. And we need to have that faith in the judicial system that ultimately justice happens, and there will be false cases being registered. That's no reason why it should not be in the rule book. Is number one. We've already seen why it's in the book, in the criminal law, in IPC, right? Okay, now let's look at the other safeguards that are particularly in place for these kind of cases, because the judges understand that these laws may be misused, or because this has been accrued, and this happens, right? This happens because these are intimate spaces. We do not get to know what happens in them. There can be issues which may lead one person to make these kind of allegations. The solution definitely is not to make it gender neutral. If you're saying abuse and you are saying therefore make it gender neutral, that's not really a very rational way to think about it, because if you make it gender neutral, then you're giving men also an opportunity to make to abuse the law, if that is your argument, right? If abuse of law is the argument, then even it shouldn't be there in IPC. It should be done away with completely, because otherwise men also get to abuse. And I would tell you this, that men in this current kind of power structure that we have, we are still not ready for a gender neutral law, right? Besides this abuse argument, the other aspect when it comes to having gender neutral law, we are still not ready. And I'm looking at the entire society as a whole. I'm not looking at just how Delhi looks like or Bombay looks like. I'm not looking at just how Lucknow looks like. I'm looking at rural areas everywhere, how the power structure is, even where a woman, for example, if we talk about sexual harassment, for example, even posh, for example, forget criminal law, just take posh for the time being. If a woman is doing well, she's outspoken, upright about things, she stands for herself, trust me, they are seen as threats. That happens. Why, I don't know, but that's what happens. And this is based on personal experience that I can tell you. And this is based on experiences of other women as well who are doing well in the career. Doing well in career is no crime, right? It doesn't even come in way of other people. It doesn't even obstruct their spaces, etc. But that can also lead to issues that can lead to false complaints against women, right? So in this kind of power structure where people are not used to seeing something and they're suddenly being exposed to it, let's first have some sort of balance there. Let's see what kind of disadvantage, let's weigh the interests of both the genders and see what can be then done to balance the interests, right? So if false complaints can be made, then what can be done so that at least no hardship is faced by these men? But if you think, just like you look at balance of convenience, right? If you look at the hardship that the kind of violation a woman would go through, then you wouldn't want that to happen, right? So how do you balance these? So you have a law and then you have some safeguards, right? So safeguards, of course, this case, the one I was talking about, Justice Deepak Mishra's judgment, Social Action Forum for Manav Adhikar case, right? It says we think it appropriate to direct that the investigating officers be careful and be guided by the principles stated in Joginder Kumar, Lalita Kumari, and Anish Kumar. Now, Anish Kumar says less than 7 years, and this was also a case dealing with 498A, since the punishment is less than 7 years, therefore, anticipatory bail would be granted. Right? So you cite Anish Kumar, you get anticipatory bail even before you are arrested. Lalita Kumari says there has to be a preliminary inquiry in these kind of cases, right? In matrimonial which are based on matrimonial disputes. That's sorted. DK Basu, again, there are safeguards on arrests, etc., and these are common, right, for everyone. Now, if these safeguards are followed, and then you already have, like, you need to go to women's cell, and I know the procedure, how it's done, it actually doesn't get misused so much unless the person has some sort of kind of some sort of influence, etc., to get FIR registered. Registering FIR is very, very difficult for 98 cases, trust me. Because first you'll be sent to a counselor, then you'll be, even if the counselor understands you because she comes from a certain kind of background, she understands, she has studied these kind of cases and stuff, and then you go to the IO, and then the IO would be like, okay, I'll call the other side, and then you sit and mediate, etc. And trust me, my client comes to me and says, look, if somebody slaps someone on the road and they go to register an FIR, they would, right? So why are not they registering it when it's clear that I have been beaten up? Right? So it's like that. It's like, because people who are in charge, who are supposed to investigate the matter, they come from a background where it's okay to hit someone once or twice when they're living with you. It's not someone again. It's okay to hit a woman, right? Or they would be different. It would be different if they're coming from a certain class. They can have their own biases. So we are operating in a society where members of the society have their own biases. I'm not free from bias. Okay, if somebody comes to me, I'm very sure I would think, right, because I have also been subjected to kind of violence that I was not, and I'm not talking about intimate spaces. I'm talking about public places. And that shows up in my where if someone comes to me and says something, and I immediately catch it, oh, this is happening because I have experienced something similar, and therefore it's happening. So it's difficult for some people. It requires a certain degree of consciousness to be able to catch it. So biases can be both ways, right? So I would just like to leave it here and open it to questions. When we look at other criminal, we just dealt with cruelty because of positive time, but there are other laws as well, right? Like stalking, like you have kind of outraging, disrobing a woman. Now, how many times have you heard a man being disrobed, right? Now that's the concept. I mean, you disrobing a woman is again denotes something, and therefore it's being done. If it's being done, then you need to take care that it's not done, because then whatever that it denotes, it's being faced by the woman. Like maybe it shouldn't be considered as modesty being outraged. Maybe it shouldn't be connected with modesty. But since it is, then you have to do something about it. Since stalking has led to so many crimes in the past, you have to do something about it. That's why these laws have been in place. If you look at Justice Verma Committee's report, they have done an extensive study. They have been they interacted with so many NGOs, and to understand what the situation is like, right? And then they have put in those kind of safeguards and those kind of remedial measures in place, right? I'll again, there's in the provision on kind of sexual remarks being made, sexually colored remarks being made. Now, I mean, I can understand that men may also go through that, but it's way more rampant among women, and the way it's the kind of words that are used are, you don't find a kind of male counterpart for those words, right? To give you an example, Randi is so commonly used in certain places, just a woman going, Randi. Right? There's no such word for men that any woman can be even thought to be using it. right? So just a kind of example I gave you, and now I'm opening. I just gave you thoughts to think on and to then tell me what you think about it. It can be anyways. It can be whatever. Again, Article 51A of the Constitution, if you look at Constitution, it's a fundamental duty of every citizen to renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. If we all can do this, I don't think these laws will be required. We can do away with these laws and we can completely do away with them, or we can make it gender neutral when those times come, right? With this, I would like to end and open it to questions. Over to you, Vedant.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, my first question is, how do you define gender studies and how important is it for students to study this as a subject in law school?
Right. So I was very fortunate that I took up this subject when I was in law school, and it really helped me to understand because I was doing sociology, I was doing other subjects that people do in an integrated course, and the whole purpose of integrating these courses was meant to provide you a basis, sociological basis, economic basis, political basis of why and how these laws are passed, right? When you look at history, how these, like when I was reading history of women's movements, how the suffragists, what they did, how they did, all that kind of, whenever I look at the provision that you have right to vote, it just makes it more real for me that this is what people went through for this law to come in place, right? And then you can also understand the basis why a certain group of people would not want it, why a certain group of people would want it, what it signifies, what how you can expand the scope of law. For example, right to life. Now, can you imagine if somebody just sticks to the law as it is? Can you imagine them to expand it to say, you know what, even the procedure should be even Article 14, etc., has to be read into Article 21. You know what? Right to life should include right to live with dignity. You know what? Right to food is also part of right to life, right? So all of that comes not in blue. It comes from the very fact that you have understood the society, you have understood how human beings operate, what dignity stands for, not just for you who comes from a privileged background. That's then the problem that our whole education system is such that all good law schools you find mostly elite people can send their boards. And trust me, even if you want to engage in discourse that are amazing and egalitarian and all of that because you want to sound good, but you remain elitist. You can't really relate to a person who is living in poverty on the streets, sitting in an AC room. You really cannot understand. Even now as I speak, I know, I mean, those people, when they speak, it's so different from how I would do it. But still, reading about them, understanding the theories also have a very important role to play. Because when I was doing women's studies, the kind of whatever I was sharing with you, these kind of principles, etc., emerge from what I read at that time, and it helps me to develop principle-based arguments and argue in court, not just on women-related issues, but other issues relating to marginalized communities as well. Yeah.
So, ma'am, my next question is, ma'am, as you talked about different universities, so, ma'am, there are n number of centers for gender studies in numerous universities and also in top-notch universities. So, do you think they are doing enough for this cause?
Right. So it comes under a statutory requirement. So there's a requirement that these universities should have a center for gender studies, and that's why they have it. Now the problem is, now that's the first battle won. So first, now I really want every university to have a center for disability studies as well. So that's first battle won. At least you have people talking about it, you have people studying it, right? People will enroll, people will study, and when they study, they will get to discuss, they will get to take it elsewhere in the campus as well. It won't remain confined to the center. That's the reason why they are there, to raise a certain kind of awareness. I am nobody to say that no one is doing anything and all these centers are away. Because there are many centers who are trying. They have to remain in the academic ambit. You also need to understand there's a certain role that academics are supposed to play, and they're playing that role. Let's give it to them for that. And then there are roles that activists need to play. There are certain roles that lawyers need to play. So we all are playing different roles in the society, and to put it on somebody and say that this is your role and you need to do it properly, I don't think that's right. But yes, there can be much more that can be done in the area of academics itself. But again, the problem is that these centers are only in a few universities, and then they don't go beyond those universities. For example, law schools, IITs, they become like a ghetto, and they just do their own stuff, and there's no intermingling happening among these universities. And so the kind of exposure I got, because I went to a central university, was very different from what national law school people, for example, would get. So I think there has to be some sort of intermingling happening there for exchange of discourses, so that we know that so much more exists, so that because I can clearly see the difference. It feels like there's a difference of upbringing, because 5 years you have spent in a certain kind of environment, and it's very, very difficult to get those kind of just by reading stuff, and you don't get it. You have to be engaged in a certain kind of discourse, and that happens only when you have these kind of academic spaces.
Okay. So my next question is like, ma'am, right from my childhood until now, like I'm in my second year, like I'm seeing there is a usage of word he everywhere, be it commentary, be it our textbook, be it our parents. And while giving example, like we use he did this, or Ram did that, Sham did that. Like, ma'am, how can we see it? Is it a type of bias, or in which manner like people are using the word he?
Right. So this is part of the way language is used, right, to make somebody invisible, right? So and it's not even, you don't even see any problem with it. You'll be like, it's fine. We use something, right? We're using he. What's wrong? You can use she. What's the problem? No, but the thing is, I don't even want to use she. Of course, there can be something also that there is a need for gender neutral languages. Why? Because it reflects as well as it reinforces what is already there in the society. Right? You change the language, you change all of that. Like it's a very, it can be a very symbolic kind of change, but trust me, language does have an impact on the stereotyping, and therefore to make them more visible, you use she or he, and he or she, and it just makes, suddenly you realize, oh, they're a woman as well. Otherwise, somewhere in the mind, it doesn't get registered that way. And there's so many examples of in our daily lives where, I mean, for example, mankind. Now people are trying to use humankind instead, right? Then you have so many problems in the language, the way the language has been devised. You can't change every word. Like you have widow. Widow is a woman and widower is a man. Whereas, so widow is the generic word here. Whereas when you look at woman, man is the generic word, and you add W. You can't change all of this. Then you have to change the attitude, because even if you replace the word, if the attitude stays there, even if I've seen people who use politically correct language, but they are even worse, right? So that's not the end of the battle, but yes, it definitely has an impact. And you have journals where if you don't send a gender neutral language, they won't accept your submissions, right? So I think that should be there as well. But anybody not using it, it shouldn't be taken against them, and because it's so much in vogue that you just can't say, oh, it means you are discriminating, it means you're committing violence. No, it doesn't mean so much actually. Ultimately, who the person is, what he's doing in his life is what matters. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes. So, ma'am, you talked about that substantial equality. So, ma'am, in this, you're asking like it is equality of opportunity or equality of outcome for all the genders?
both opportunities. So when you're saying equality, I of course mean right to be free from discrimination, right to be free from violence, right to make your own choice, right to be autonomous, right? So all of this becomes part of that equality and right to have opportunity, equal opportunity. But so all of that is definitely part of right to equality. But when I use the word substantive, when I add the word substantive to it, then you also see if there is something else that needs to be done to ensure equality. Then it's not just about, for example, if somebody needs a wheelchair, you don't provide them a scribe, right? So you provide them what they need. If a woman needs certain kind of protection, if for example, protection order under DVI, you provide them that. If a man needs protection from, say, abuse of these, not this law per se, but other kinds of law, right? Then where he can be arrested, right? So then you provide safeguards for that. So that's how you achieve substantive equality. It can't be that, okay, now we have given you the law, let's now forget about it, I don't care what barriers you face to get it implemented. That's not how it's to be seen, even for opportunity. And therefore I gave you the example of reservation. I'm not saying it should be for a woman, etc. All I'm saying is that's the basis for affirmative action of any sort, whether it be for socially and educationally backward classes, etc. That's the basis, that you need to be able to provide them substantive equality and whatever is needed to get rid of the unequal. It can be stereotypes, it can be stigmas, it can be glass ceiling. So then what do you do? Do you give something more to them so that these go? Right? Or they can fight it out, they can have more representation in the society, and then that's the basis for these kind of affirmative actions. And that should be said to be the basis of these kind of laws as well. This is to ensure substantive equality. This is to ensure, and substantive equality won't be possible if there's no freedom from discrimination, if there's no freedom from violence. There won't be even equality of opportunity. Everything is so intricately related. If somebody is experiencing violence, how do you imagine them to use the opportunities they have? How do you imagine them to even have opportunities in their lives if they're dealing with it? Depends where they're dealing with it. If it's an intimate space, it gets very, very difficult for them to even talk about it. For example, if a girl child is not being sent to school after a certain age, what do? You're not able to do anything about it. So at least the kind of violence that's visible, that people are talking about, please do something about it. Even that comes into economic abuse. But can you imagine a girl child talking about it when she's 16, 17? No. There's so many other kinds of violences that are happening. When I talk to women students, elsewhere in other kind of, not in Delhi kind of setup, trust me, the kind of issues they talk about, this is happening in my house, and you have to be very, very, but they need to be able to trust you to talk about that. And then you feel, where do we live? I don't even know that these things happen, right? So that's the thing, that there's so much that we can't do much about. So at least whatever we can do about, let's do this. And to provide them safe spaces is one of the things we can definitely do wherever we are. Responding responsibly to whoever is talking about it. That's one of the things we can do wherever we are, both with non-binary genders. I think it's very high time that our treatment towards them changes, and then only we can see change in law, change in the society. Yeah.
Yes. Ma'am, recently our Honorable Chief Justice of India, N.V. Ramana sir, talked about reservation of women in the higher judiciary, like they should ask for their rights. It's their basic right to have 50% reservation. But when talking about the present situation, ma'am, there are only 4 female judges in the Supreme Court. So ma'am, does this have an effect on how laws are interpreted and applied?
Thank you so much for asking this question. I have so much to talk about. One of the things I missed out while I was talking about girl child. Now, many of these women, I recently did a podcast on women in litigation. Now, many women who even manage to go to law school. Firstly, there are so many women who don't manage to go to law schools because their parents are like, oh, it will take 5 years, don't go. You do a 3-year general, whatever you want to do whatever you want to do, but you don't do law because it will take you 5 years or 6 years to complete graduation, and by then there will be nobody left to take you, right? So now that's the problem, first problem. Now somebody doesn't have that hurdle or faces the hurdle successfully, goes to study law, then they're like, fine, great, you're studying law, great, but you know what, only judiciary is good for you, right? Everyone around will tell you that. And then you're like, okay, fine, let me accept it, or let me start teaching, or let me do something which is more acceptable, like soft kind of jobs, because litigation is somewhere you have to deal with criminals and stuff, and it's not, even if you say you're not going to do those cases, no, it's not. Logic doesn't work. I mean, judge's life is way more difficult and way more tough, but especially in lower courts, but no. Okay, now this hurdle crossed, then comes the next hurdle of the what we call glass ceiling, what we call stereotypes, right? And now even these women who make it in lower judiciary, and there are so many women, then you can imagine the number of women who are making it in the lower judiciary, because everyone's saying judiciary is good for you. Great. So now they're getting selected. Where are they going? Why are there not so many women? So whenever there's something that's merit based, whenever you have a written exam, there are more, and you have an interview as well, but still whenever it's merit based, there are more women, whereas whenever there's more use of discretion being allowed, there are less number of women, and that's happening everywhere, even in promotions, etc. as well, right? So this has to be, even in class, I mean, I've seen women doing exceptionally well, and now these women are going to, if they have already cracked the lower judiciary examination, then something is happening somewhere. And I don't think reservation solves it. I think one needs to understand that if there are not enough women, something has gone wrong, right? Something has already gone wrong, and you need to be able to find out where those biases are coming, and how do you train these judges? How do you train everyone involved in the process in such a way that all of these biases go? That's the thing we should aim at. And these are all unconscious biases. I know, I'm very sure there won't be a single male judge who would tell you that women shouldn't be promoted because they are of no good use. No, you would find them. It means there are unconscious biases. And how do you identify them? How do you understand that it's operating and yet get over it and make the right choice? I think people need training for that. I think judicial academies should start training, should have those trainings. It shouldn't just be for the sake of it. It should be very, very real.
So, ma'am, as we know that daily different schemes are coming, which are being launched by the central government or the state government. Let me name them, like be it Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Bal Kanya Saridhi Yojana, Sukanya Samriddhi Yojana, Ladli scheme, or Kanya Kosh scheme, or national scheme for incentive of girl child, or Ladli Lakshmi Yojana of Madhya Pradesh government, and there are n number of schemes coming. But still, ma'am, India has been positioned 140 out of 156 in gender gap index by WEF this year. So where do we see India in the coming future in terms of the gender gap or in terms of your development?
See, I would say these policies are definitely important, right? So you can't just say that these are for the sake of, pleasing certain kind of, just to get votes or something. You can't just do away with it. You just can't dismiss these policies by saying this. These policies definitely have some impact. Now, whether these policies are being implemented properly, that has to be seen. Whether these policies are being taken seriously, that has to be seen. The very fact that these policies are seen as something that kind of creates that's what are these policies doing? Why are we not even questioning other policies? Why are we not questioning how the other policies are doing and whether we should have other policies or not? We're not doing that. We're not getting into that process. We're getting into the process of this, which has the potential to have some result, right? So let's try and put our efforts to ensure why are these policies in place. Just like with laws, let's understand what is the intention of these policies, and then as citizens also, can we do something which is within our reach to get those objectives fulfilled so that then the funds can be used in other policies for something else, right?
So, ma'am, would you like to add anything to this topic? Like, what
Sorry?
are so? Would you like to add anything?
Add anything? I think this was an amazing session. I really enjoyed, and I would just like to end with saying that again, something that I already said, of providing spaces, of being responsible when such incidents are being reported, as lawyers, as law students, when you listen to these things and the kind of bias that comes to your mind, to catch those bias, to catch it, and see to what extent you can be neutral. I'm not saying you need to be biased on the other side. I mean, you need not be very, very, have a very woman-centric approach, but at least to have a neutral approach, you need to be able to free from biases. This is an exercise I constantly keep doing with myself, right? And this is something that will be useful for you as well. And to kind of, especially when it comes to, I told you, the gap between experiences. So if somebody tells you that, look, this is sexist, look, this is something you should not do, or the person says this is ableist, then consider it. Consider it for a while, give them the benefit of the doubt that they come from that class if they are saying, and this is an approach that's followed in the West as well. I once questioned conduct, I call it ableist, and they actually told me, Sanchita, if you're finding it ableist, then it must be. I won't tell you it's not. Similarly with racism, that's how they've dealt with racism, right? And that's why you find a kind of integration in those societies. Racism would have been way more if this approach wouldn't have been there, that if you're calling it racist, then it must be racist, and we are going to take it seriously. It should be that. It should be that. You take it seriously, nothing comes out of it, great, but take it seriously. Thank you. Over to you, Vedant. I'm sorry, I can't, your screen just...
I think, ma'am, there was some network issue on this part of the Vedant. Vedant, are you back? Okay, no issues, Vedant. Let me continue.
I'm there. Yes. Ayush. Yes.
Okay. Ma'am, Ayush Pandey, on the behalf of whole Just Corpus team, thanks you for such a wonderful session. The participants in the live chat box on YouTube are thanking and they are commenting like very nice session. We want to interact. Like there are a number of questions which we have seen. We have conducted this session after a long time. So there was a huge crowd which is hearing you. So at last, I, on the behalf of whole team of Just Corpus, thank you so much, ma'am, for such an insightful and knowledgeable session. We enjoyed a lot in this. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ayush, for inviting me. I enjoyed it too. I think there should be more such discussions. I really like the kind of work you guys are doing. Thank you.